comfortably zoned with the Zig Zag Man in Alameda, California, pushing on the doors of life marked pull and fighting the unholy trinity as we go. Big business, organized religion, and government.
I am back, and you are flying high with me, Ralph Tyko, over the zone in Alameda, California, right across the bay from San Francisco in the eastern part of the Northern Bay Area. And I am blessed. I have a very special guest. He's an author, a writer, a raconteur, a Renaissance man, a Chicagoan, originally from New York, Dan Epstein. How are you, sir?
I'm great, Ralph. How are you doing today?
Good. I want to talk about what you have going first, and then I'm going to ask you some questions about being a Tigre fan growing up, rooting for them, and Al Kaline and Paul Maxwell, and there were some terrific days. But first and foremost, podcast radio is basically a selfless self-promotion. That's how I describe it. And with that in mind, I like to start many of my interviews by asking my guest what it is he or she would like to get out there in terms of publicizing your work, your appearances. How goes it for you these days, Dan?
Well, I'm a freelance writer, so I would say ask about anyone who's a freelance writer right now, and the forecast is not excellent. I'm in the process of juggling writing gigs for Rolling Stone, Revolver Magazine, the Jewish Daily Forward, and a bunch of other outlets. I've just started doing some stuff for October, which is a website devoted to beer and beer culture. And that's all been great, but it's a hustle, and I think I'm grateful that I can actually make a living doing this, but it's I'm trying to find ways to transition back into the 9-to-5 world.
I got you. Tell me about the Jewish Forward. When I was a kid, I happen to be Jewish, and my father spoke and read Yiddish, and there were two newspapers that I know of in New York that served the kosherly inclined, and one was the Forward, and one was the Tug, the Day. And if I'm not mistaken, the Forward was, as the title suggests, a more progressive newspaper. Am I correct about
right.
that?
Exactly. And to tell you the truth, I mean, when I started writing for the Forward, I was ignorant of its long and glorious history. But my father, who grew up in Brooklyn, in a family where the parents were basically immigrants, Jewish immigrants from Russia and Poland, was very familiar with the Forvitz, and told me that my grandparents would be quite proud if they knew that their grandson was writing for the Forvitz.
Nice. That carries on the tradition. What part of Brooklyn did you grow up in? I grew up in Queens.
I didn't grow up. My father grew up in actually like Crown Heights, basically. And at one point they lived pretty much within quick walking distance of Ebbets Field. So my father grew up a Brooklyn Dodgers fan, and used to wait with his friends at the whatever the nearest subway stop was to Ebbets Field, because you would get the that's where you could sort of ambush the players, especially the players from opposing teams, as they were coming to the ballpark to play a game. And he said, like, you just looked for the guys in the nicest suits, and even if you didn't recognize them from your baseball cards, you kind of figured that if they were wearing suits that nice, they had to be ball players.
And he'd go down for autographs, and I'd do basically the same thing. I would go downtown by the Garden, and the Biltmore and the Roosevelt. The players would come in and stay down there, and it was terrific being a kid growing up in New York. Did you grow up in the city itself?
I only lived there for the first year and a half of my life. My folks were living on the Upper West Side of Manhattan when I was born, and then my dad, who was an assistant professor at Columbia at that point, accepted a position at the University of Michigan. So we moved to Ann Arbor, and that's how I became. That's why the Tigers are my number one baseball team. They were
all right.
my first major league experience.
I will ask you, did you become a journalist because of your sports interest, or were you did you become a journalist and then gravitate towards sports?
The latter. I mean, I was a fan of baseball since I was 9 or 10. 10 was really the year, 1976. That was really the year where it all came together for me as a baseball fan. But I became a journalist for two reasons. One, my mom was married for a time to a man who was a reporter for the LA Times, and before that had been a reporter for two of the major Chicago papers. And he was, he had all kinds of amazing stories about his travels and his experiences. And I was so fascinated by his life and what he did. And I was always an avid reader and loved words and information. So I would see him do his thing, and I would see him when he was hanging out with his journalist pals, and listening to them trade stories. And I just thought, like, this is the life for me. This is what I want to do. But what really got me writing was music, and being a huge music fan and offering my high school paper, that I would review records and concerts for the paper. And those were my first bylines, writing about whatever was interesting to me musically in 1982 and 1983 and 1984. And it just kind of went from there, working on the college paper. After college, I came back to Chicago and played in a band for a while and started writing for a local magazine here in Chicago. And I slowly realized that it was much more satisfying and certainly much more lucrative to write than it was to play in a rock band. So that's what kind of, that's kind of where my journalism. I want to
find out what your musical tastes are. What was your first album when you were a kid?
Ooh, well, first one I ever bought was actually a weird Dutch import 2 LP Best of the Beach Boys set. I was lucky enough to have an aunt who had grown up in the 60s and had an amazing record collection, and so that was really the first music that I fell in love with. Like her, she had the Beatles, Beach Boys, Zombies, Animals, things like that, and so she would kind of teach me about all this stuff, and then I kind of took it from there.
Can you imagine if there were no Beatles, how the Beach Boys would have taken off? Not that they didn't, and not that they weren't incredibly successful and melodic and all those things, but the Beatles, as I see it, as I look back, really overshadowed everything.
Yeah. Oh, they stole the show.
And I think the first to suffer were the Beach Boys. That's just my opinion.
Well, sure. And they were label mates for one thing. So of course, whereas Capitol Records had all their resources behind the Beach Boys, here comes the Beatles, so obviously their attention is going to be divided at the very least. So yeah, no, I absolutely agree.
Well, I've got to tell my Beach Boys story. I went to junior high school 145, and there was a kid named Bob Moran. Went to school, and we all would change classes at breaks and everything. The Beach Boys had a song out, Bob, 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 Bob Moran. And Bob Moran would walk in the hall, and every kid that passed him would, boy or girl, Bob, 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 Bob Moran. Now, I don't know what happened to Bob Moran, but at first it was cute. But the look on his face changed. I mean, this was a big hit for a long time. So, but that's what I remember about the Beach Boys.
Yeah.
So, tell me about your Detroit Tiger fandom. What was your first game? And was Ernie Harwell a big part of your growing up?
Oh, Ernie was the best. Ernie, I did the total sneak my transistor radio with a white earplug under my pillow at night, so I could listen to the Tigers games when I went to sleep, especially if they're playing on the on the West Coast or whatever. The games would be broadcast late. So Ernie Harwell was my first was my introduction to baseball radio broadcasts, and I love Vin Scully, and I lived in LA for about 22 years, so I had ample opportunity to listen to Vin and loved every minute of it, but Ernie's always going to be number one for me. But my first Tigers game, first one I ever went to in person was May 30th, 1976. It was kind of like a belated birthday present for me. My dad had been taking me to the University of Michigan baseball games, and I loved them, and I was well behaved at the game, so my father figured he could take me to Tiger Stadium and I'd be okay. And it was the Tigers versus the Yankees, and 1976, and my book Stars and Strikes which is about the 76 season, gets into this. It's like the 76 was really the first year that the Yankees were good again after a long drought. And so it was kind of exciting, even as someone who was not a Yankee fan, to go to see the Tigers, who were terrible, play this resurgent Yankees team. And this was a team with Thurman Munson, who actually hit a home run that day, and Mickey Rivers, a lot of just really exciting players to watch. Greg Nettles at third, Willie Randolph, who was a rookie that year at second base. But what I remember most about that game was that we had really good seats. My dad, it was not hard to get good seats behind the plate to Tigers games in early '76. So we had a really good view of what was happening at home plate. And I remember that the managers, Ralph Houk for the Tigers and Billy Martin for the Yankees, came out to hand over the lineups at home plate. And Billy Martin got into a heated argument with the home plate umpire while handing over the lineup card, and it got so heated that the umpire tossed him before the game even started. And I was just fascinated by this, just like, what the hell is going on? And my father was trying to explain to me that this was probably related to a call that umpire had made the other night, and Billy just wanted to have the last word on it. But in retrospect, I mean, this was a Sunday afternoon game, and in retrospect, knowing what I know about Billy Martin, he was probably brutally hungover from hitting his favorite Detroit night spots on Saturday night, and just wanted any excuse to get out of there and get some hair of the dog in him.
Yeah, well, I live out in the Bay Area, and Billy managed Oakland for a little bit, and
Right.
he had the same hungover experiences out in Oakland. Billy had demons. Let's put it.
He did. He did.
But,
he was a fascinating guy and a great manager, but he had issues.
Yes. You could write a book about that.
Many have, actually.
Yes, and many have. Peter Golenbach has. He was quite a character, a storied guy. For a kid growing up in New York with a Billy Martin glove, I was lucky enough several times to interview Billy Martin Jr., who was not Alfred Martin Jr. He chose Billy. Billy Sr. hated his dad so much that he didn't want him included in the name of his kid, so he named him Billy Martin Jr. And it's Billy Jr. is a very, very warm, sensitive, articulate guy who just has many stories to tell. And his dad was just obsessed by managing the Yankees.
Yeah.
That's all he wanted to do. Billy Jr. tells a story of him managing in Texas, and he's finally happy. He's gaining a little weight. Just seems to be in a good lifestyle. And one day he announces to his son, and can't think of his name, a journalist, a writer who befriended Billy in Texas, who he's very close to, and he says to both of them, they're both thin, he says, "I'm going to manage the Yankees again next year." And they both looked at him and said, "Are you frickin' crazy? What are you doing?" These are the people that loved him as much as anybody loved him in the world and wanted what was good for Billy Martin. And he says, "No, I'm managing the Yankees. I'm going back." Steinbrenner called, or this, that, and the other thing. We worked it out for the fifth time. I mean, he was literally fired 5 times by George Steinbrenner, who played into his Billy's weaknesses and kept him on a string. And George Steinbrenner was a cruel son of a bitch.
Just a horrible human being. Really.
Yes.
I understand, like, from a Yankee fan perspective, like that. He deserves some respect for, bringing the Yankees back to a place of prominence, but he
opened the pocket.
Horrible.
He opened his pocketbooks, and you have to respect an owner who does that from the standpoint of being a fan. But the more you learn about this guy, I have a weekly podcast with Peter Golenbach, and we've done it for about a year now. And
excellent.
the subject comes around to Jackie Robinson and Branch Rickey, or Steinbrenner, invariably.
Two polar opposites.
Absolutely. The best and the worst of human beings, and we talk about other things too, of course. But wow, George is something else. Yet, and I will say that every human is neither all good or all bad. Another person I'm fortunate enough to have on my network, David Nemec, the great trivia and old-time baseball writer, grew up in Cleveland and was coached by Steinbrenner in amateur ball. Well, I don't remember what sport, and knew him quite well, and knew a different side of him, and presents, without making excuses for the rest of George, he presents a side of George, that his early years, that's interesting. Let's put it that way.
A little more nuanced.
Yeah. So, I want you to make a case for Trammell and Whitaker going into the Hall of Fame.
I still so vividly remember when those two guys were called up to the Tigers and played their first games in late '77, and like most baseball fans and writers, I have made more than my fair share of terrible predictions. I remember, for example, one was that a player named Doug Alt, who was the first baseman for the expansion year Toronto Blue Jays in 1977, he hit two home runs.
Sacramento, California, as a matter of fact.
That's right.
Go ahead.
He hit two home runs on opening day in 1977, and I went to school the next day and very loudly predicted that he was going to be the American League MVP that year. That did not work out as I predicted. But I also predicted, it was actually like during show and tell announcements in my, I guess, fall of 1977, that would have been the beginning of my sixth grade year. I remember announcing that the Tigers had these two rookies who were coming up, and they were going to be among the all-time greatest Tigers to ever play. And to this day, I can at least say I called that one right. They were just phenomenal. The longest running keystone combination in baseball history. I doubt we'll ever see anyone or any pair of infielders break that record. And just, so important not only to that to the really good Tigers teams of '84 when they won it all and '87 when they went to the playoffs, but just like day in, day out, such key members of the team, team leaders, guys you could count on defensively and offensively, just students of the game. And I don't often buy into the notion that you have to play in New York or Boston to get noticed by the Hall of Fame, but it is just unconscionable to me that Lou Whitaker, I don't think he even got enough votes his first year of eligibility to make it onto subsequent ballots. And that just blows my mind. Maybe if both he and Trammell had become eligible the same year, it might have been a different story, because then you could have made a case for, a better case for these guys going in together. But I think Whitaker retired a year before Trammell, which is why that didn't happen. But I think that is one of the great oversights by the Hall, that those guys are not in the Hall of Fame.
Okay. Would you be kind enough to tell me something about Sparky Anderson that I don't know as a typical baseball fan?
Other than the fact that he was basically fired and blackballed by Mike Ilitch for siding with the players during the labor disputes in '94 and '95.
I'd like to know about. Is that what caused? Did he go into a depression over that? Was it? He passed away recently, and there were rumors of dementia, or that is unfortunately true. He was suffering from dementia for, I think, at least the last 5 years of his life. Okay. And Ilitch blackballed did indeed blackball him from baseball for that. Am I correct?
Yeah, that is what I understand. Was that basically, if you recall, the beginning at what was supposed to be the beginning of the 1995 season, the players were still on strike. So owners around the leagues were pulling in all these scab players, minor leaguers, retired guys, just, people who couldn't have made the cut on a major league roster, but that they were warm bodies to fill the uniforms. And every major league manager at the time agreed to work with whatever players their teams were bringing in to what qualified as spring training at that point. The only manager in the major leagues who refused was Sparky Anderson. He said, this is a disgrace. I am not putting on the Tigers uniform to manage this, this motley assemblage of unqualified players. And Mike Ilitch felt that was insubordinate on Sparky's part, and he felt that Sparky was, intentionally embarrassing him by refusing to participate, and essentially vowed then that he was going to give Sparky the axe at a later date. And so he fired him at, I believe, at the end of the season, and Sparky was only 61 at the time, and certainly one of the most respected managers in baseball. I think he was the first to win World Series in both leagues, with teams in both leagues. Mm-hmm. And he, think about it today. How many major league managers do we have in their 60s? It wasn't like, Sparky was always an old-looking guy, but it wasn't like he had lost his faculties at 61. But he was never able to get another job and as a manager. And the feeling from most of the folks I know who were in and around the Tigers media pool in the mid-'90s is that Ilitch just not only wanted Sparky gone, but put out the word that he did not want him working again, and managed to achieve that goal.
Sad for Sparky.
Yeah, and so when Mike Ilitch died last year, there was enormous outpouring of grief from Tigers fans and the Michigan media, and Ilitch obviously did a lot for the team. But there's a whole lot that he did not do well or right, and blackballing Sparky, firing and blackballing Sparky is definitely right up there. Along with the abandonment of Tiger Stadium and the refusal to acknowledge Tigers who had been stars before Ilitch had taken over the team. So
how was he with race relations?
I don't think
Ilitch.
I don't think he was necessarily any worse than any of his contemporaries, but I do think that there's, this gets into the whole issue of Detroit demographics and gentrification, but I think, Ilitch put a lot of money into gentrifying certain parts of Detroit and bringing it up, but those are parts that, are very, let's just say he did not do much to bring up the black neighborhoods in Detroit. He did not do much to contribute to that side of Detroit's demographics.
Okay. How about Jack Morris in the Hall of Fame? What do you think about his numbers and his eligibility?
No. Before I get any further into the Hall of Fame conversation, let me say that I am not somebody who places a whole lot of stock in. Obviously, I would love to see Whitaker and Trammell be honored, but on a day-to-day basis, it doesn't bother me who is in and who is not in the Hall of Fame. I think it's Hall of Fame arguments are. I for me, one of the most tiresome things about baseball fandom. Like at the end of the day, I don't really care, and especially with the induction of Bud Selig into the Hall of Fame, that to me is like putting the Red Hot Chili Peppers into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It's like at that point, if you're putting those clowns in, then the whole thing is moot. And I feel that way with Bud Selig, who was really one of, if not the worst commissioner in baseball, did a lot of damage to the game, and even before he became commissioner, did a lot of really shady and seedy things that he should not be rewarded for, and yet continues to be. So that said,
well, we have O'Malley in the Hall of Fame. We have Bowie Kuhn, I think, is in the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, well, yeah, Bowie Kuhn is. I mean, O'Malley I can kind of see, but Bowie Kuhn is a joke as well, and I think so there's a lot of bad meat in the Hall of Fame. So that said, I think Jack Morris was a great pitcher. I loved watching him pitch. I think he's borderline at best. Like if you want to make a case based on his numbers compared to pitchers who were in or even pitchers of his era. If he went in, hey, as a Tiger fan, that'd be great. It doesn't bother me at all that he's not in, however.
I would like to see coaches, scouts, baseball, other baseball people in. Comes to mind Roger Craig, who was the pitching coach for Sparky, and really formed that was the basis of them winning. What with that split finger that he was teaching. Dave Righetti out here with the Giants has put a streak together of years and years of turning over pitching staffs and keeping them great. And
Leo Mazzoni,
have a Hall of Fame.
I absolutely agree.
Okay. Anything about Roger Craig that you remember as a Detroit apologist?
No, I mean nothing specific. More just like you were glad you're glad that he was around, but nothing really sticks out to me about his time in that capacity.
Okay, well, I do want to mention, without good catching, very, very rarely does a team win. And Detroit, for years, had Bill Freehand. And
yes, totally underrated catcher.
Underrated, solid every year. Why was he as underrated? Was it because of folks like Munson who were more vocal? Was it the New York press that supersedes anything, it seems? What contributed to that?
Well, I don't think it was just the New York press and Munson. I mean, I think Freehand came up a few years before Johnny Bench, but when Freehand came up in the when did he start? What was his first season? 62, 63. I mean, when he came up, I don't think there was, with the exception of Yogi Berra, who had been, it had been several years since Yogi was in his catching prime at that point. It wasn't really the era of the superstar catcher. I really think you see that start to develop with Johnny Bench in the late 60s with the Reds, where like he's not just like the guy behind the plate handling the pitching staff and occasionally throwing out a runner. I mean, Bench was a guy who was hitting 40 home runs, had an absolute cannon for an arm, really it was impossible not to have the spotlight on him. Whereas Freehand was more of, he was, your archetypal Joe Lunchbale. It's like he did what he did. He wasn't flashy about it. He hit 200 home runs over the course of his career. So he had power, but he wasn't anybody's idea of a cleanup hitter. He wasn't the guy that the Tigers had Willie Horton or Al Kaline or Norm Cash. They had those kind of guys to really drive in the runs. Freehand was always the guy, about seventh in the batting order, but he was out there 120, 130 games a year, just catching and handling the pitching staff, and when you're working with Denny McClain, Mickey Lolich, and Earl Wilson, and they're all all three very different pitchers, very different temperaments, and they all have success working with you. That says a lot right there.
Right. There's one icon in Michigan that will probably is if you say Bob Gibson, not Bob Gibson, Kurt Gibson. In Michigan, what's the answer? I mean, what do people say? Is there anybody more popular than this gentleman in Michigan?
Well, I'd say it sort of depends on the generation. I mean, I think for a lot of people, nobody's more popular than Al Kaline or maybe Willie Horton. But yeah,
I guess I'm just talking post K-line. Let's put it that way.
I think there is. I mean, there is a lot of affection for Kirk Gibson. I think there is. The Tigers have installed him as one of their broadcasters in recent years, and there's a lot of discussion on Tiger fan groups and blogs about whether Gibby's actually a good announcer or if he's just given the gig because of his iconic status as a Tiger in the Tigers' history. But I know he's incredibly his legacy as a player is incredibly respected and loved, and I've seen him at Comerica Park interacting with people, and I've always been impressed. I've heard some not so nice things about Kirk Gibson and the way he relates to people, but every time I've seen him, I've always been impressed by how how kind he is with people, how so many situations where he could totally big time somebody and just blow past him, whether it's a fan or a maintenance worker at Comerica, just somebody he doesn't have to talk to, but he always stops and has a smile and a few nice words, and time for a laugh, and that has always impressed me about him.
Dan, as a journalist, who are some of your favorite people to cover? People that you like personally?
I write mostly about music still as a journalist. I've written a couple of books on baseball in the 1970s, but I do much more music coverage on a day-to-day basis. I would say I've been lucky enough to be in the game for 20 plus years, so there are certain people that I've interviewed multiple, even in the double digits amount of time, and I would have to say one of my all-time favorite people to interview is Marilyn Manson. And I know that's something that comes as a surprise to most people, but I find him invariably amusing, extremely intelligent, always up for a good conversation that can touch on a number of topics, although baseball is not one of them. But I think he's one of the few people in the music business, one of the few big artists left who understands that interviews are not only just part of the deal, but that they're part of the art. They're part of amplifying who you are and what you want to put out there to the people beyond what's on your record, beyond what you do in concert. And that always makes for an incredibly entertaining interview. And I've had some very memorable nights hanging out at his house and just talking about the world and talking about horror movies and talking about, obscure 19th century literature. And so anytime I get an assignment to write about Manson, I always look forward to it.
Very cool. Hey, I just listen to music. I just love music. I'm not a critic. I'm not anything. But what do critics think about the Wilburys, especially early Wilburys? Were they absolutely great, or is it just me? Maybe Dylan and all those guys, Harrison, coming back. I thought they were terrific. I listened to them about 4 times a week.
Wow. So you're the guy.
Do you agree?
I said, so you're the guy who listens to them on a regular basis.
Okay, well, I got my answer. That's all right.
Yeah. I always felt, and I mean, they were well reviewed in Rolling Stone and at the time, but I really feel, and I know many other critics who feel the same, that this was a case of some of the parts being much smaller than the individual elements. I mean, obviously these are 4 or 5 incredibly talented people who have all made massive contributions to my record collection and everyone else's. But it always seemed very kind of half-assed to me. Like they're clearly having fun together, but
right. Were they having too much fun? Did they seem to be having too much fun?
I think. Well, I mean, look, I'm a huge fan of fun. I don't think fun should ever be restricted, but I do feel not so much. I mean, it's great that they're having a good time doing it, but it almost seems like everyone came to the project with second-rate material, and I think you have this a lot with quote-unquote supergroups, where it's like everybody's happy to be part of this, but nobody, everybody's saving their A material for their next record. And I really felt like that was the case with the Wilburys.
Gotcha. All right, then I'm just going to top everything and throw my favorite musical icon, passed away a year or so ago, Mose Allison.
Oh, yeah.
Are you familiar with Mose?
Yeah, absolutely. My uncle was the one who got me into Mose, and and I think it took me a little time to wrap my head around what he was doing, because it seemed, it was not what I was used to, when I was listening to blues music or blues influence music or jazz influence music, but in retrospect, the way he synthesized those influences into something very personal and very recognizable, yet also, very classic in the sense that, you could get a band like The Who to cover Young Man Blues and kind of make it their own, but it sounded like a song that had been around forever. I think he was just immensely talented and probably still not as appreciated as he should be.
Right. Well, I'm glad you responded better than you did to my favorites, the Wilburys. Hey, listen, Dan, you're a Renaissance man. You mentioned horror movies. My girlfriend, Tally Olson, Tally Makes Soap, who is really the mainstay of the Comfortably Zoned radio network. We'll get into that another time. But she's a horror movie buff.
Right on.
And just loves horror movies. So that I want you to promise the next time you come back to this airwaves, we'll have Tally on and you guys can talk horror movies. How about that?
Oh, we absolutely. I will talk horror movies any day of the week. That's definitely one, next to music and baseball. That's probably my third greatest obsession.
Terrific. Thank you, Dan. I love getting to know you, and I hope you will indeed return and return often. And I'm going to implore you and the whole audience to do 4 things.
All right.
Keep your humor dry. Keep your dreams wet. Keep your kids out of recruiting stations, military recruiting offices, and grandkids.
Amen to that.
All right? And keep your children off the laps of clerics that wear dresses. Now, those are 4 independent things. You could take them individually. You could put them together. Sometimes, like the individuals won't get the higher part, like with the Wilburys. You know, it's a great idea, but you put them all together and it doesn't gem. I don't know. Whatever works for you as an audience out there, that's my only advice, if I could leave you with that. And till that time, my friend, this has been fun and interesting.
Same for me, Ralph. Anytime you want me back, just let me know.
Beautiful, I will. Enjoy your day, and everybody out there, keep on keeping on. Adios.